The rain was coming down in sheets over Lower Wacker Drive when Matteo De Luca stepped out of his armored Audi A8. This was supposed to be a standard drop, a peace offering from the Greco Syndicate to end a 2-year bloodbath that had crippled Chicago's underground. The text from Roman Greco had been brief, a gift to cement our future, left in the trunk of the Lincoln. Matteo's men stood back in the shadows, rifles lowered but ready. Matteo turned the key, the hydraulic hinges groaning as the heavy lid rose. He expected duffel bags of untraceable hundreds or stolen artillery. Instead, the sight that met his eyes paralyzed the most feared man in the city. The smell of ozone, city grime, and damp concrete hung heavy in the subterranean cavern of Lower Wacker Drive. It was 2 a.m., a time when the city above was asleep, but the arteries below pulsed with the illicit lifeblood of Matteo De Luca's empire. He stood in the glow of the Lincoln Continental's tail lights, the red glare painting the harsh, unyielding angles of his face. At 34, Matteo had carved out a reputation as a man carved from ice, methodical, ruthless, and entirely devoid of the emotional vulnerabilities that had gotten his predecessors killed. But as the trunk of the Lincoln fully opened, the ice cracked. There was no cash. There were no weapons. Curled into a fetal position, bound with heavy-duty zip ties and trembling violently in the cold, was a woman. Her blonde hair was matted with dried blood and rainwater, her expensive trench coat torn and soiled. A piece of industrial duct tape covered her mouth, and her eyes, wide, terrified, and reflecting the harsh red light, darted frantically until they locked onto Matteo's face. Matteo's heart, an organ he usually only noticed when pushing himself in the boxing ring, slammed against his ribs. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, quiet hiss. Sienna. Sienna Hollins, the daughter of Tobias Hollins, the civilian financial advisor who had managed the De Luca family's legitimate assets for 2 decades before passing away of a sudden heart attack last year. Tobias had been a mentor, a father figure, when Matteo's own father had proven to be nothing but a monster. Matteo had made a silent, sacred vow to Tobias on his deathbed. He would ensure Sienna remained entirely insulated from the syndicate. He had spent the last year aggressively pushing her away, ignoring her calls, acting the part of the cold mobster, just to keep her safe in her bright, legitimate world of art curation in the Gold Coast. Now, she was lying in the trunk of a rival boss's car, like a piece of discarded meat. Pinned to the lapel of her ruined coat was a cream-colored envelope. Matteo reached out with a gloved hand, his fingers trembling imperceptibly, and snatched it. He ripped it open. The handwriting was elegant, mocking. "You loved the father. Now you can bury the daughter. The truce is off, De Luca. You're next." "RG, boss." Enzo Parisi, Matteo's underboss and closest confidant, stepped forward, his Smith & Wesson drawn. Enzo's eyes widened as he peered into the trunk. "Jesus Christ! Is that Tobias's kid?" Matteo didn't answer. He couldn't. A dark, primal rage, something ancient and utterly terrifying, bloomed in his chest, hot and suffocating. He holstered his own weapon, leaned into the trunk, and gently but swiftly ripped the tape from Sienna's mouth. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, coughing as the cold air hit her lungs. "Matteo!" she sobbed, her voice hoarse, broken. "Matteo! Please!" "I've got you," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its usual authoritative edge. It was a whisper, meant only for her. He pulled a serrated tactical knife from his belt and carefully sliced through the thick plastic zip ties binding her wrists and ankles. The moment she was free, she didn't shrink away from him as he expected. Instead, she threw her numb, bruised arms around his neck, burying her face in the wet wool of his overcoat. She was freezing, her body shaking so hard her teeth chattered against his collarbone. Matteo froze for a fraction of a second, the contact alien to a man who hadn't been embraced in years. Then his arms came around her, pulling her tightly against his chest. He lifted her effortlessly out of the trunk. "Enzo!" Matteo barked, his voice echoing off the concrete pillars, hard and lethal. "Burn the Lincoln, leave nothing, and tell the men we are officially at war with Roman Greco. Anyone wearing his colors is dead on sight." "Understood," Enzo replied, his expression hardening. Matteo carried Sienna toward his waiting Audi. The rain continued to batter the streets of Chicago, but as Matteo slid into the back seat, with Sienna still clinging to him, the storm outside was nothing compared to the violent tempest brewing in his soul. Roman Greco hadn't just broken a treaty, he had signed his own death warrant. The DeLuca estate sat on 20 acres of heavily wooded land in Lake Forest, a fortress disguised as a multi-million-dollar architectural marvel. Iron gates, thermal cameras, and armed guards patrolling with Belgian Malinois ensured that the violence of the city rarely touched the pristine lawns. By the time the Audi pulled through the gates, Sienna had passed out from shock and exhaustion. Matteo carried her through the grand foyer, ignoring the shocked expressions of his night staff. He bypassed the main sweeping staircase and took the private elevator up to the east wing, a secure zone restricted only to him. He laid her down on the king-sized bed in the primary guest suite, the soft Egyptian cotton starkly contrasting with the grime and blood covering her. "Call Dr. Aris," Matteo ordered a shadow in the doorway. "Dominic, one of his personal guards. Tell him to get to the estate now. Tell him to bring everything for trauma." For the next 45 minutes, Matteo sat in a leather armchair in the corner of the room, watching her chest rise and fall. He had stripped off his wet overcoat and rolled up the sleeves of his black dress shirt, the intricate tattoos mapping his forearms dark against his skin. He couldn't look away from the bruising on her cheekbone, the nasty cut on her temple. Every mark on her skin felt like a failure on his part. He had pushed her away to protect her, only to leave her vulnerable, a target for a monster like Greco, who knew how to exploit the ghosts of Matteo's past. Dr. William Aris arrived, breathless, his medical bag clutched in his hand. Aris was a discreet surgeon who had lost his license to a pill addiction a decade ago, but had found lucrative employment stitching up DeLuca soldiers. He moved quickly, checking Sienna's vitals, cleaning the lacerations, and administering a mild sedative and painkillers via an IV drip. "She's lucky, Mr. DeLuca," Dr. Aris whispered, packing away his tools as the dawn light began to creep through the heavy velvet curtains. "No broken bones, minor concussion, mostly superficial tissue damage and severe dehydration. She needs rest, fluids, and time. The psychological trauma, however, that's outside my expertise." "Thank you, William. Enzo will see to your compensation." Matteo dismissed him without looking away from Sienna. When the door clicked shut, the room fell into a heavy silence, save for the rhythmic beeping of the IV monitor. Matteo moved from the chair to the edge of the bed. He reached out, his calloused knuckles lightly brushing a stray blonde curl away from her bruised face. 5 years ago, before his father died, before the crown of the syndicate was forced upon him, Matteo had attended a gala at the Art Institute of Chicago with Tobias. Sienna had been there. She was 22 then, radiant, laughing, untouched by the shadows. They had shared a single dance, a moment on a balcony where the air had sparked with undeniable electricity. Matteo had almost kissed her, but then he looked at his own blood-stained hands, thought of the enemies waiting in the dark, and walked away. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to her since. Suddenly, Sienna shifted. Her breath hitched, and her eyes fluttered open. For a moment they were hazy, lost in a nightmare. She panicked, thrashing against the sheets, her hand flying to her mouth as if expecting the duct tape. Sienna, look at me," Matteo said firmly, catching her flailing wrists and holding them gently but securely. "You're safe. You're in Lake Forest. Greco is miles away." She stopped fighting, her chest heaving, as she blinked the blurriness from her vision. She stared at him, taking in his exhausted, shadowed face, the dark stubble on his jaw, the raw concern in his eyes. "Matteo," she whispered, her voice weak but steadying. She didn't pull her hands away from his grasp. "He took me from my gallery. 2 men. They shoved me into a van. They told me my father's debts were being called in." "Your father had no debts," Matteo said, his voice a low rumble. "Greco lied. He used you because he knew Tobias meant something to me. He used you to try and break me." Sienna swallowed hard, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her bruised cheek. "Did it work?" Matteo leaned in closer, the proximity electric despite the grim circumstances. He could smell the faint trace of her vanilla perfume beneath the scent of rain and antiseptic. "It did the opposite," he swore softly. "It just guaranteed I'm going to burn his entire world to the ground." By noon the next day, the DeLuca estate was a war room. Black SUVs choked the circular driveway, and heavily armed men patrolled the perimeter in tactical gear. The truce was shattered, and the Chicago underworld was bracing for a seismic shift. Inside, Matteo stood at the head of a massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by his capos. Maps of the city were spread out, marked with Greco's known fronts: warehouses in Pilston, a meat-packing plant in Fulton Market, underground casinos in the South Loop. "We hit his logistics first," Enzo was saying, pointing a thick finger at the map. "Cut off his cash flow. Without money, his mercenaries will scatter." Matteo wasn't fully listening. His mind kept drifting back to the guest wing, to the woman sleeping under the heavy duvet. He excused himself abruptly, leaving Enzo to coordinate the initial strikes, and walked the long, silent corridor back to her room. When he opened the door, he stopped. Sienna was awake. She had managed to unhook her empty IV bag and was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, wrapped in one of his oversized black cashmere sweaters, looking out over the grey waters of Lake Michigan. "You shouldn't be out of bed," he said, stepping into the room. She turned. Despite the bruising and the pallor of her skin, there was a fierce, resilient light in her eyes that caught him off guard. She wasn't breaking. She was processing. "I couldn't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that trunk," she said quietly, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked at him, really looked at him. The sharp cut of his suit, the lethal grace in his posture. "You're different than I remember, Matteo. Harder." "The world I live in doesn't allow for softness, Sienna. I tried to keep you out of it." "You did a terrible job," she shot back, a flash of anger cutting through her fatigue. "You ignored me for a year after my dad died. I thought you hated me. I thought I did something wrong. Now I wake up to find out I'm a pawn in some Mafia chessboard." Matteo closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. He looked down at her, his dark eyes intense. "I didn't hate you. I ignored you because it was the only way I knew how to keep a target off your back. Greco is a rat. He searches for weakness." "And I'm your weakness?" she challenged, tilting her chin up. Matteo didn't answer with words. The heavy silence that stretched between them said everything. The air in the room thickened, the undeniable gravity pulling them together, a sharp contrast to the violence outside those walls. He raised a hand, his thumb lightly grazing her uninjured cheek. She leaned into the touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. But before the moment could tip over the edge into something irreversible, Sienna pulled back slightly, her expression shifting from vulnerable to urgent. "Matteo, wait. There's something you need to know. Something I heard." He dropped his hand, instantly shifting from a man on the edge of a kiss back to a boss. "What did you hear?" "When they had me in the warehouse, before they put me in the Lincoln, Greco came in. He was talking on a burner phone to someone in your organization." Matteo's jaw tightened. "Are you sure? He could have been faking it to scare you." "No," Sienna insisted, stepping closer, her voice dropping. "He used your real name, not your street name. He told the guy on the phone, 'Keep DeLuca focused on the west side. Make sure he doesn't look at the port. Greco is bringing something big into the port, Matteo.'" And the man he was talking to, I couldn't hear his voice, but I heard Greco say, "Just keep your head down and keep spinning that silver lighter of yours." Matteo froze. The blood in his veins ran cold. A silver lighter. He closed his eyes, a rapid succession of images flashing through his mind. The poker games in the back room of the speakeasy, the sit-downs with the families, the nervous habit of flicking the lid of a silver, custom-engraved Zippo. Click-clack, click-clack. It wasn't a low-level soldier. It was Dante. Dante Russo, his chief enforcer, and a man who had sworn loyalty to Matteo's father 20 years ago. Dante, who was right downstairs in the dining room, looking over the strike maps. Matteo opened his eyes, the absolute chill of betrayal settling over his features. He looked at Sienna, realizing she hadn't just survived. She had just handed him the key to winning this war. "You're sure about the lighter?" he asked, his voice deathly quiet. "I'm sure," she said, reading the dangerous shift in his demeanor. "Matteo, who is it?" "Someone who is going to regret the day he was born," Matteo said softly. He reached out, gently cupping her face one last time. "Lock this door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me. Understand?" Sienna nodded, her breath catching at the cold fury radiating from him. Matteo turned on his heel and walked out of the room, the lock clicking shut behind him. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, feeling the comforting weight of the Glock 19 resting in his shoulder holster. It was time to weed the garden. The heavy mahogany doors of the dining room swung open, and Matteo stepped over the threshold. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale espresso and expensive cigar smoke. 5 of his highest-ranking men were leaning over the sprawling blueprint of Chicago, their voices a low, urgent murmur. As Matteo approached the head of the table, the room fell into a sudden, respectful silence. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over the men. They landed on Dante Russo. Dante was a relic of the old regime. He had served under Matteo's father, Lorenzo De Luca, a man who ruled with a sledgehammer rather than a scalpel. Dante was 58, with a face mapped by knife scars and a loyalty that Matteo had always assumed was unshakable. He stood near the window, a scowl etched into his weathered features, rolling a silver, custom-engraved Zippo lighter between his knuckles. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound, usually a minor annoyance, now echoed in Matteo's ears like a funeral bell. "Enzo," Matteo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't take his eyes off the map. "Status on the Fulton Market raid." "Teams are assembled, boss," Enzo replied, stepping up to the table. "We hit the meatpacking plant in 20 minutes. We'll cripple his distribution lines and burn the fleet of trucks." Matteo leaned his hands on the polished mahogany, staring intently at the red markers clustered on the west side. "Change of plans. Call the teams off Fulton Market." A murmur of confusion rippled through the capos. "Boss?" Enzo asked, frowning. Greco's vulnerable there right now. We are redirecting all primary strike teams, Matteo announced, straightening up. His gaze drifted casually to the far end of the table. We are hitting the South Chicago shipping terminals, Pier 41. The reaction was instantaneous, though invisible to an untrained eye. Dante's hand froze. The Zippo lighter slipped, clattering harshly against the wooden table. Dante hastily snatched it up, shoving it into his pocket, a thin sheen of sweat suddenly appearing on his forehead. Pier 41, Dante rasped, his voice rough. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to mask his panic with authoritative bluster. Matteo, with all due respect, the port is a ghost town. Our intel says Greco is heavily fortified on the west side. If we send our boys to the docks, we're chasing shadows and leaving our own flanks exposed. Are we, Dante? Matteo asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, soft pitch. He slowly walked around the table, the men parting for him like water. You seem very certain about Greco's movements. I oversee the street-level informants, Dante stammered slightly, backing up half a step as Matteo closed the distance. I know how Greco operates. He doesn't use the ports. The unions down there hate him. Funny, Matteo said, stopping mere inches from the older man. The tension in the room spiked, the air growing suffocatingly thin. Enzo's hand instinctively drifted toward the inside of his jacket. I recently acquired some new intelligence, very reliable. It suggests Greco is bringing something massive into Pier 41, and he specifically wants me distracted on the west side so it can dock unnoticed. Dante's eyes darted frantically toward the door. Who told you that? It's bad intel, boss. It's a trap. Sienna Hollins told me, Matteo whispered, leaning in so only Dante could hear the venom in his voice. She heard Greco talking to his little rat, a rat who likes to spin a silver Zippo. The color drained entirely from Dante's face. He lunged, his hand flying toward his waistband to draw his weapon, but he was too slow, too old, and completely outmatched. Matteo moved with terrifying, fluid speed. He grabbed Dante's wrist, twisting it sharply until a sickening crack echoed in the room. Dante howled in pain, dropping to his knees. Before he could hit the floor, Matteo drew his Glock 19 and pressed the cold muzzle directly against Dante's forehead. "Guns on him!" Enzo roared, and instantly 5 weapons were drawn and leveled at the traitor. "Boss, please!" Dante begged, his tough exterior collapsing into pathetic desperation. "Let me explain. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Matteo said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of the Reaper. "You sold me out to Greco. You helped him take Tobias's daughter. You let that animal put hands on a civilian under my protection. You made us weak, Matteo." Dante spat, blood and spit flying from his lips, a sudden, desperate anger overriding his fear. "Your father was a king. He took what he wanted. You run this family like a Fortune 500 company. Greco promised me the Southside rackets. He promised me a return to the old ways." "The old ways are dead, Dante, and so are you." Matteo's finger tightened on the trigger. "But before I end you, you're going to tell me exactly what is arriving at Pier 41. And if you lie, I will let Enzo practice his surgical skills on your kneecaps." Dante sobbed, defeated. "Midnight. Tonight. A cargo container from Genoa. It's not just drugs, Matteo. It's Victor Volkov's people. They are bringing in military-grade C4 and a ledger of every corrupt judge and politician in the state. Greco is buying the city. He's going to use the C4 to blow your Lake Forest estate to dust." Matteo absorbed the information, his face an impenetrable mask. Greco wasn't just trying to win a gang war. He was trying to wipe the De Luca family off the map entirely. Matteo slowly lowered his weapon. He looked at Enzo. Take him to the soundproof room in the basement, Matteo ordered quietly. Get his phone. Extract every message, every contact. When you are done, take him to the limestone quarry. Leave him for the crows. No, Matteo, please. I served your father, Dante screamed as Enzo and another capo hauled him roughly to his feet, dragging him toward the heavy double doors. My father is rotting in hell, Matteo called after him. Save him a seat. When the doors clicked shut, cutting off Dante's pleas, the remaining capos stood in stunned silence. Matteo holstered his weapon, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, as if he had merely swatted a fly. Gentlemen, Matteo said, turning back to the map. The ice was back, colder and sharper than ever. Cancel sleep. Call in every soldier we have. We are going to Pier 41 tonight. We are not just stopping a shipment. We are burying Roman Greco. The adrenaline crash hit Matteo the moment he stepped out of the private elevator into the East Wing. The fire that had propelled him through the interrogation and the tactical planning faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He loosened his silk tie and unbuttoned the collar of his shirt, rubbing the back of his neck. He walked quietly down the hall, expecting Sienna to be asleep. Instead, the door to the primary guest suite was slightly ajar, casting a warm sliver of golden light onto the dark carpet. Matteo pushed the door open. Sienna was sitting cross-legged on the oversized leather sofa near the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames. She had showered. Her blonde hair was damp and falling loosely over her shoulders. She was wearing one of his white button-down shirts, the sleeves rolled up, revealing the dark purple bruises on her wrists where the zip ties had bitten into her skin. She looked up as he entered. The air between them shifted instantly, the heavy, unspoken gravity returning. Is it over? She asked softly. Matteo walked over to a crystal decanter on the sideboard and poured 2 fingers of Macallan 25. The rat is dealt with. It was Dante. Sienna closed her eyes, letting out a heavy sigh. I remember Dante. He used to bring me lollipops when I visited my dad's office as a kid. In this life, the ones who bring you candy are usually the ones hiding the poison, Matteo said, taking a sip of the scotch. The burn grounded him. He walked over and sat in the armchair opposite her, his elbows resting on his knees. Because of you, we know Greco's plan. He's bringing in a shipment tonight. Explosives. He was planning to hit this house. Sienna visibly shuddered, wrapping her arms around her knees. You're going to the port, aren't you? Tonight? I have to. If Greco gets that shipment, he controls Chicago. No one will be safe. Especially not you. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with the ghosts of the past year. The crackle of the fireplace was the only sound in the room. Matteo watched the firelight dance across her face, highlighting the delicate curve of her jaw, the haunting sadness in her eyes, and the harsh, violent bruises that ruined her porcelain skin. Why did you shut me out, Matteo? She asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, but it shattered the quiet like a gunshot. After my dad died. I needed you. He trusted you. I thought we had something. That night at the gala, on the balcony. Matteo tightened his grip on the crystal glass until his knuckles turned white. He looked down at the amber liquid, unable to meet her gaze. I shut you out because I looked at you and saw the only pure thing in my life, he confessed, his voice rough, scraping against his throat. He set the glass down and finally looked at her, his dark eyes entirely stripped of their usual armor. Your father spent his whole life trying to keep you clean of the blood on my family's hands. If I had let you in, if I had let myself feel what I wanted to feel for you, I would have dragged you into the dark. I thought ignoring you was the only way to keep you in the light." Sienna stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, blurring the sight of the most dangerous man in Chicago, looking utterly defeated. "And look how well that worked out," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. She uncrossed her legs and stood up, walking slowly across the space, separating them. "I ended up in a trunk anyway. You can't control the dark, Matteo. You can only choose who you face it with." She stopped in front of him. Matteo remained seated, looking up at her. He felt a desperate, agonizing pull toward her, a physical ache in his chest that rivaled any bullet wound he had ever taken. Sienna reached out, her small, bruised hands gently cupping his face. Her thumbs brushed over the dark stubble on his jawline. "I'm not made of glass, Matteo," she said fiercely, a tear finally spilling over her lashes and dropping onto his hand. "I survived, Greco. I survived the trunk. I am Tobias Hollins's daughter. Do not insult me by pretending I need to be locked in a tower to be safe." Matteo couldn't breathe. The scent of vanilla and the warmth of her skin obliterated every rational thought, every tactical plan, every vow he had made to a dead man. He reached up, his large hands wrapping around her wrists. Careful, so careful of her bruises. He pulled her down onto his lap. Sienna let out a soft gasp as she straddled his legs, her arms immediately wrapping around his neck. "Sienna," he breathed, a final, desperate warning. "If I kiss you, I am never letting you go. You will be mine. In this life, with all its blood and all its shadows, there is no going back." She looked deep into his eyes, her gaze unwavering, fierce, and entirely certain. "Then kiss me and don't let go." Matteo broke. He pulled her down, crashing his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of years of repressed longing, fear, and desperate relief. Sienna kissed him back with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. Matteo's hands slid down her back, gripping her waist, anchoring her to him, as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling off the edge of the earth. He tasted the salt of her tears and the sweet, intoxicating essence of her, losing himself completely in the blinding heat of the moment. For the first time in his life, Matteo De Luca wasn't the boss. He wasn't the strategist or the executioner. He was just a man, desperately clutching the woman who held his soul. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, Matteo rested his forehead against hers. He kept his arms wrapped tightly around her, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her chest. "You stay here," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his thumbs gently stroking her sides. "I'm leaving 10 men outside this door. Dominic has orders to shoot anyone who steps foot on this floor. I'm going to Pier 41. I'm going to end Roman Greco." Sienna pulled back slightly, looking at him with eyes that were no longer terrified, but burning with a quiet, fierce resolve. "Come back to me, Matteo," she demanded softly. "You owe me a real date. No galas, no mafia politics. Just us." A slow, genuine smile, a rare, breathtaking sight, spread across Matteo's face. He kissed her forehead, lingering on her skin. "I swear it on my life, Sienna. When the sun comes up, this city is ours, and Greco will be nothing but ash." He gently lifted her off his lap and stood up. The vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, lethal predator that the underworld feared. He strapped his shoulder holster back on, checking the magazine of his Glock before grabbing a sleek, black tactical jacket from the closet. As he walked out the door, leaving Sienna bathed in the warm firelight, Matteo felt a terrifying clarity. He wasn't just fighting for territory anymore. He wasn't fighting for his father's legacy. He was fighting for his future. And God have mercy on anyone standing on the docks tonight, because Matteo De Luca was going to bring hell to the water's edge. Pier 41 was a sprawling labyrinth of rusted shipping containers, towering steel cranes, and slick, rain-washed concrete that smelled of diesel, salt water, and decaying fish. The midnight fog rolling off Lake Michigan hung low and thick, turning the industrial graveyard into a ghost town. It was the perfect place for a secret to arrive, and an even better place for a man to disappear. Matteo De Luca crouched behind a stack of blue Maersk containers, the icy wind biting through his tactical jacket. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, but the cold seeped into his bones. He ignored it. His focus was entirely on the water's edge. Beside him, Enzo Parisi checked the thermal optics on his customized M4 carbine, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Spread out across the pier, invisible in the shadows and the fog, were 40 of the De Luca family's most lethal operators. They were hand-picked, thoroughly vetted, and hungry for blood. Dante Russo's betrayal had sent a shockwave of cold rage through the ranks. Loyalty was the only currency that mattered in this life, and Greco had tried to counterfeit it. "Visual on the target, boss," Enzo whispered into his comms unit, the earpiece crackling faintly in Matteo's ear. 300 yards out. Looks like a Panamanian freighter. Matteo raised his binoculars. Through the heavy mist, the dark silhouette of a cargo ship cut through the water, its engines a low, throbbing hum that vibrated through the concrete under their boots. "Hold positions," Matteo commanded, his voice a low, steady rumble over the encrypted radio channel. "Nobody breathes until I give the word. We wait for Greco to expose himself. We wait for the container to touch the ground." 10 minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The massive freighter bumped against the heavy rubber tires lining the dock. Ropes were thrown, and the ship was secured. On the pier, a convoy of 6 black Cadillac Escalades rolled silently out of an abandoned warehouse, their headlights extinguished. They formed a semicircle near the docking bay. The doors opened. Roman Greco stepped out into the damp night. Even from a distance, Matteo felt a visceral surge of hatred. Greco was a man who wore his ambition like a cheap cologne. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal topcoat, a silver-tipped cane resting in his right hand, an affectation rather than a necessity. He was flanked by heavily armed mercenaries, their silhouettes bulky with tactical vests and automatic weapons. "Look at this arrogant son of a bitch," Enzo muttered, his finger resting lightly beside the trigger of his rifle. "He brought a private army." "It won't save him," Matteo replied softly. He watched as the ship's onboard crane groaned to life. A massive, unmarked grey shipping container was hoisted into the air, swinging slightly in the wind before being lowered to the dock with a deafening metallic clang. Greco stepped forward, a smug, triumphant smile visible even through the binoculars. He signaled to one of his lieutenants, who approached the container with heavy bolt cutters. The heavy steel doors shrieked open. Inside, illuminated by harsh halogen work lights, were stacked wooden crates stamped with Cyrillic lettering, Viktor Volkov's C4, and sitting atop the crates, a sleek, black metal briefcase, the ledger, the keys to the city. "Now," Matteo whispered. He raised his suppressed Sig Sauer MPX. He didn't aim for Greco. He aimed for the halogen lights illuminating the container. Pft, pft. 2 rounds shattered the bulbs, plunging Greco's immediate vicinity into pitch blackness. "Light them up!" Enzo roared over the comms. The docks erupted into apocalyptic violence. The De Luca snipers, positioned high on the gantry cranes, opened fire. The heavy-caliber rounds punched through the engine blocks of the Escalades, disabling Greco's escape route instantly. Panic seized the rival syndicate. Greco's mercenaries returned fire blindly into the darkness, the muzzle flashes strobing like violent lightning in the fog. Matteo moved. He didn't stay pinned behind cover. He was a phantom, utilizing the labyrinth of shipping containers to flank the panicked enemy. The years of rigorous training, the brutal sparring matches, the cold discipline he had forged to survive his father's reign, it all culminated in this moment. He was fluid, lethal, and completely detached from fear. Pop! Pop! Two of Greco's men dropped as Matteo rounded a rusted red container, his shots precise and instantly fatal. He stepped over their bodies without a second glance, his eyes locked on the chaotic center of the dock where Greco was screaming orders, trying to fall back toward the open shipping container. "Enzo, secure the C4. Do not let them breach those crates." Matteo barked into his comms, ducking as a spray of bullets sparked against the steel wall inches from his head. "I'm on it. Moving in," Enzo replied, the sound of his M4 tearing through the night. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. Matteo cut through the crossfire, a predator single-mindedly tracking his prey. He saw Greco's silver-tipped cane discarded on the wet concrete. Greco was scrambling up the ramp into the dark cargo container, desperate to reach the metal briefcase. Matteo holstered his submachine gun and drew his Glock 19. He sprinted across the open ground, sliding the last few feet as a mercenary took aim at him. Matteo fired twice from his back, dropping the man before rolling to his feet and lunging into the pitch-black maw of the shipping container. The inside of the shipping container was suffocatingly tight, a sensory deprivation chamber that smelled heavily of cosmoline, cheap Russian tobacco, and the sharp, metallic tang of raw fear. Outside, the world was ending. The muffled staccato of automatic gunfire, the shrieks of tearing metal, and the chaotic roars of dying men vibrated through the corrugated steel walls, turning the container into a resonating tuning fork of violence. Matteo De Luca moved silently through the pitch-black space, his boots making zero sound on the ribbed metal floor. His breathing was perfectly controlled, a steady, rhythmic intake of oxygen that kept his heart rate entirely leveled. He raised his Glock 19, the tritium night sights glowing with a faint, ghostly green luminescence. He was a creature of the dark, entirely in his element. "You're a dead man, De Luca," Roman Greco's voice echoed from the far end of the container. It was high-pitched, ragged, and laced with the absolute terror of a man who suddenly realized he was cornered by an apex predator. "Viktor Volkov will skin you alive for this. You think you can take this city? You think burning a few trucks makes you a king? You're nothing but a suit playing dress-up. You don't have your father's stomach for the slaughter." Matteo remained silent. He took another deliberate, measured step forward, letting the darkness and the silence work as psychological weapons. He knew exactly what Greco was doing. The rival boss was projecting, desperately trying to mask his own crumbling sanity with loud, hollow bravado. "My father was a butcher," Matteo finally said. His voice was deadly calm, an icy whisper that seemed to detach itself from the shadows and echo off every metal wall simultaneously, making it impossible for Greco to pinpoint his exact location. "He killed blindly. He killed out of anger and paranoia. He left messes for other men to clean up. I don't." A frantic, desperate scratching sound filled the air. A spark ignited, followed by the sudden, harsh hiss of a road flare. Searing, violent red light flooded the back half of the container. Roman Greco was standing 20 feet away, backed against the stacks of wooden crates stamped with faded Cyrillic lettering. He was shaking violently, his tailored charcoal coat stained with grease and rainwater, his slicked-back hair falling wildly across his face. Sweat poured down his forehead, despite the freezing temperature of the damp night. In his left hand, he clutched the sleek black metal briefcase, the ledger that contained the souls of half the politicians and judges in the state of Illinois. In his right hand, he held the burning red flare, hovering dangerously close to an exposed, pale block of military-grade C4 protruding from a splintered crate. "I'll blow us both to hell!" Greco screamed, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and utterly unhinged. The red light of the flare cast grotesque, dancing shadows across his panicked features. "I'll drop this flare right now. I swear to God, Matteo, I will do it. Back off. Tell your men to stand down and give me a clear path to a vehicle." Matteo stepped out from behind a stack of rusted mechanical parts, stepping fully into the bleeding red light of the flare. He didn't lower his weapon. He didn't flinch. His dark eyes locked onto Greco with the impassive, terrifying stillness of a shark circling bleeding prey. "You won't do it, Roman," Matteo stated, his voice devoid of any inflection. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the distance between them closing to 15 feet. "You're a survivor, a parasite. A rat always looks for a way out, even when the trap is already closed on its neck. Dying in a dirty metal box on Pier 41 means you lose everything, and your ego cannot stand the thought of losing to me. You took my territory," Greco spat, the flare trembling so hard in his grip that drops of molten slag hit the steel floor, hissing as they cooled. "You took Dante. You took my men." "You brought this on yourself the second you broke the truce," Matteo replied, taking another step. 10 feet now. He could see the frantic, erratic pulse beating against the collar of Greco's expensive shirt. "You could have stayed on the south side. You could have run your little rackets and lived to be an old man. But you got greedy. You reached out to the Russians. You thought Viktor Volkov's explosives would make you untouchable." Greco let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "It would have. With this ledger, I owned the police commissioner. I owned the district attorneys. I was going to wipe your precious Lake Forest estate off the map, De Luca. I was going to bury you in the rubble of your father's empire." Then, the desperate smile on Greco's face twisted into something cruel and venomous. He shifted tactics, searching for the one nerve he could strike to make the ice-cold boss falter. "But I took the girl, didn't I?" Greco sneered, lowering the flare just a fraction of an inch closer to the explosives. "Oh, you should have seen her, Matteo. She whimpered like a stray, beaten dog when my men threw her in the trunk of that Lincoln. She was begging, crying out for her daddy. Tobias Hollins was a fool. He spent 20 years washing your family's filthy money, thinking he was keeping his precious Sienna clean. He hated you, Matteo." Matteo stopped moving. The air in the container seemed to freeze. "That's right," Greco hissed, sensing he had finally struck a nerve. "Tobias told me himself before he had that convenient little heart attack. He knew what you were. He knew that beneath the custom suits and the polite manners, you were just a rabid animal like Lorenzo. He told me his biggest fear was that you would drag Sienna down into the mud with you." For a fraction of a second, the words hit Matteo like a physical blow to the sternum. The ghost of Tobias Hollins had haunted his conscience for an entire year. The guilt of pushing Sienna away, the fear that he was inherently toxic to her bright, legitimate world. It had eaten at him every single day. But then, an image flashed brilliantly in his mind, cutting through the red glare of the flare and the stench of Greco's desperation. He saw Sienna, wrapped in his oversized shirt by the firelight. He felt the warmth of her small, bruised hands on his face. He heard the fierce, unyielding certainty in her voice when she looked him dead in the eye and told him she wasn't made of glass. "I survived the trunk. I survived Greco. Do not insult me by pretending I need to be locked in a tower to be safe." She didn't look at him like a monster. She looked at him like a man. She had chosen him, shadows and all. Greco was lying. It was nothing but the desperate, pathetic thrashing of a dying snake trying to bite its way out of a corner. "Tobias Hollins knew exactly who I was," Matteo said. The temperature in the container plummeted. His voice dropped to a terrifying, absolute zero, shedding the last remnants of his humanity and embracing the lethal enforcer he was bred to be. "And he trusted me to bury trash like you." Before Greco could even process the shift in Matteo's demeanor, before his brain could send the electrical signal to his trembling fingers to drop the flare into the C4, Matteo fired. Crack. The single, suppressed shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The hollow point round struck Roman Greco perfectly between the eyes, shattering his skull and snapping his head back with brutal kinetic force. The rival boss's eyes rolled back, his body going instantly slack. He collapsed backward, slamming into the wooden crates before sliding heavily to the steel floor. The red road flare slipped from his lifeless fingers, bouncing harmlessly away from the exposed explosives and sputtering out into a dark corner, leaving only the faint, glowing green sights of Matteo's Glock in the pitch black. Matteo stood perfectly still for a long, heavy moment. The echo of the gunshot rang in his ears, mixing with the fading sounds of the skirmish outside. He exhaled a long, slow breath, finally lowering his weapon. The immense, suffocating tension that had been coiled in his spine for a year cleanly and definitively snapped. The war was over. He walked to the back of the container in the dark, navigating by memory. He stepped casually over Greco's lifeless legs. Reaching down, his leather-gloved fingers closed around the handle of the black metal briefcase. He lifted it, feeling the heavy, dense weight of the ledger inside. This single item secured his family's absolute dominance. With these names, with this leverage, no one, not Volkov, not the federal authorities, and certainly no rival syndicate, would ever dare threaten his peace again. Matteo turned and walked out of the container. The midnight fog was beginning to lift off the docks. The pier was eerily quiet now, save for the low moans of wounded mercenaries and the distant, wailing sirens of the Chicago Police Department approaching from the city limits. The DeLuca operators were moving efficiently through the wreckage, securing weapons and policing their brass. Enzo Parisi was waiting at the bottom of the metal ramp, leaning heavily against the side of a bullet-riddled Escalade. His customized M4 was slung lazily over his shoulder, and a shallow, bloody scratch ran across his cheekbone, but his eyes were bright with vicious triumph. "The port is completely secure, boss. The stragglers broke and ran the second the lights went out," Enzo reported, his gaze dropping to the black briefcase in Matteo's hand. He let out a low whistle. "Is it done? Is he?" "Roman Greco is dead," Matteo stated flatly, handing the briefcase over to his underboss. "The ledger is ours. Get the tech team to start decrypting the drives immediately." "And the explosives?" Enzo asked, gesturing toward the open container. "Rig the crates. Burn the Sol-4 right here on the dock. Dump every enemy weapon you find into Lake Michigan," Matteo ordered, his tone crisp and authoritative. "Leave Greco's body exactly where it is. Let the police find him. Let the entire city wake up tomorrow and see exactly what happens when someone crosses the DeLuca family." "Understood," Enzo said, a rare, genuine smile touching his rough, scarred features. He looked at Matteo, noticing the subtle shift in his boss's posture. The heavy, burdened aura that Matteo usually carried had vanished. "And what about you, Matteo? Where are you going?" Matteo looked toward the eastern horizon. Beyond the rusted cranes and the dark, choppy waters of Lake Michigan, the sky was just beginning to turn a bruised, pale purple. The longest night of his life was finally breaking into dawn. "I'm going home, Enzo." The drive back to Lake Forest was a surreal blur. Sitting in the back of his armored Audi A8, watching the city skyline shrink in the rearview mirror, Matteo felt the adrenaline finally leave his bloodstream, replaced by a bone-deep, crushing exhaustion. When the heavy iron gates of the De Luca estate finally parted for him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: relief. The tactical teams had stood down. The heavily armed guards had retreated to their normal perimeter patrols. The sprawling mansion was utterly silent, transitioning from a fortified war room back into a home. Matteo walked slowly up the grand, sweeping staircase, bypassing his own quarters and heading straight for the east wing. He stripped off his blood-spattered tactical jacket, tossing it carelessly over the railing. He unholstered his weapon, leaving it on a hallway console table. He didn't want to bring the violence into her room. He rolled up the sleeves of his dark shirt, his muscles aching, his knuckles bruised and raw. He gently pushed open the heavy oak door to the primary guest suite. The fireplace had burned down to soft, glowing orange embers. The room was warm and quiet. Sienna was asleep on the oversized leather sofa, curled beneath a heavy cashmere throw blanket. She had refused the bed. She had waited up for him just as she promised. Matteo walked over quietly, kneeling on the thick Persian rug beside the sofa. He didn't want to wake her, content to just watch the steady rise and fall of her chest, ensuring she was real and safe. But as he reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of blonde hair away from her bruised cheek, her eyelashes fluttered. She opened her eyes, blinking against the soft morning light filtering through the sheer curtains. Her gaze instantly found his face. She didn't flinch at the dirt, the faint smell of gunpowder, or the profound, heavy exhaustion etched into his sharp features. "You're back," she whispered, her voice thick and raspy with sleep. She reached out from beneath the blanket, her warm hand resting flat over his heart, feeling the steady, powerful, and undeniably alive rhythm beating beneath his chest. "I told you I'd come back to you," Matteo said softly, leaning forward until his forehead rested against hers. The sweet, grounding scent of her vanilla perfume finally washed away the metallic stench of the docks. "Is it over?" she asked, her fingers lightly tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Yes," Matteo breathed, his eyes closing as he let her warmth seep into his freezing, exhausted bones. "Greco is dead. The ledger is ours. The threat is eliminated. You're safe, Sienna. You're completely safe now." She slid her arms around his neck, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. "I was always safe with you, Matteo, even when you were hiding from me in the dark." He lifted his head, looking down at the incredible woman who had survived the absolute worst of his world and still chose to stand fiercely by his side. "I'm entirely done hiding," he promised, his thumb gently grazing her lower lip. "I owe you a real date. No bodyguards, no Mafia politics, just us. Whatever you want." Sienna smiled, a radiant, unbroken expression that effortlessly rivaled the sunrise breaking outside the window. "I just want you," she said simply. Matteo kissed her, slow, deep, and filled with absolute devotion, sealing a vow that no syndicate, no blood, and no enemy would ever break. He had spent his entire life ruling the underworld from the freezing shadows, but as the morning sun flooded the room, Matteo De Luca finally stepped into the light. The opening of that Lincoln trunk was meant to be the end of Matteo De Luca's sanity, a psychological strike designed by Roman Greco to break the ice-cold Mafia king. Instead, it became the catalyst for his ultimate evolution. By confronting the trauma of his past and the vulnerability he had desperately hidden, Matteo transformed from a ruthless heir trapped in his father's shadow into a formidable, grounded leader. The underworld of Chicago was purged of its poison, not just through bullets and tactical warfare, but through Matteo's realization that true strength doesn't come from isolation. Sienna Hollins proved that love and resilience are not weaknesses to be exploited, but anchors in a storm of violence. Out of the blood and betrayal of Pier 41, a new era dawned for the De Luca Empire, one built on unshakable loyalty, profound redemption, and a fiercely protected peace.